The line moved in the way that lines in transit corridors always move, in small lurches, each one preceded by a long stillness, as though the universe needed to gather itself before it could agree to let another person forward. I had been standing in it for 3 hours. I knew because there was a clock on the wall above the processing counters, a round analog thing bolted into the pale alloy bulkhead, and I had watched its minute hand complete 3 full circuits and start on a 4th. It was not a clock the Vethara had installed. It was a clock that some human had bolted up there, weeks or months ago, when the first waves of transit refugees came through this station, and someone decided that the line would be more bearable if there was a way to mark its passage. I thought that was probably true. I also thought the person who bolted it up had never actually stood in this particular line, because if they had, they might have concluded the opposite, that a clock in a line this long was not comfort but torment. The corridor was bright. That was the one thing I had not expected about Vethara Station. Every description I had received in the weeks of walking here, from other refugees on the road, from the relief workers at the way station checkpoint 2 days out, from the brief official documentation that had been pressed into my hand at the zone boundary, described it as a transit platform, which in my experience meant something half-lit and smelling of metal and old filtered air. Vethara Station was not that. The Vethara had built it as a freight hub, and freight hubs need light, and so the entire upper quarter of the structure was a series of translucent panels through which the day poured. Not a soft diffuse glow but actual direct daylight, the kind that cast real shadows on the floor and made the dust motes visible, and turned the pale alloy walls a faint warm gold in the late afternoon. I had been outside for 8 months. I had expected to miss the daylight when I came inside. I did not expect to find it waiting for me. The line moved. I moved with it, 3 steps, then stillness. I was carrying a field pack on my back, standard issue, canvas, drab green. The seams were stitched twice since I had acquired it from a supply cache outside what had been the processing settlement at Karev. I was wearing what I always wore, field trousers, a worn pair of work boots that had been resoled once with material I still wasn't entirely sure about, and a jacket. The jacket was the one item of clothing I still thought of as mine rather than as something I was wearing. It had been a heavy weather work jacket once, before the transit years, the kind with reinforced elbows and a snap-button collar and deep internal pockets. I had added patches to it over time, the way you do when something starts to wear through, a square of darker canvas over the left elbow, a strip of weather-seal tape along the collar seam. There was also, on the left breast, slightly above where a chest pocket would have been if the jacket had had one, a small cloth patch, roughly 10 centimeters square. Off-white, or what had been off-white once, now the color of old bone, sewn on with dark blue thread in a slightly uneven running stitch that pulled a little tight at the corners. The patch had 7 letters on it. They were embroidered, not printed, actual thread work, done by hand, the letters slightly uneven in height, the spacing between the 4th and 5th letters a fraction wider than it should have been, as though the person sewing them had paused there for a breath before continuing. The letters spelled a name. I had watched her sew it. That was the thing I thought about most often in the quiet hours, not the name itself, not the face that went with the name, but the act of sewing. She had been sitting at the kitchen table in the house that is not there anymore, in the late afternoon, in the slant light that came through the west window, and she had her reading glasses on even though she was not reading, and her hands were shaking slightly. Not trembling, just that faint unsteadiness that comes when a person is trying very hard to hold something together, and their hands are not fully cooperating with the effort. The thread had gone through at a slight angle on the R. She had not gone back to correct it. I do not think she had the steadiness left for correction. She had given it to me the morning I left. We did not speak very much. There was not a great deal left to say that the two of us had not already said, or tried to say, or found we could not say no matter how many attempts we made. She pressed the jacket into my hands and I looked at it for a moment, and then I put it on and she straightened the collar and I walked out the door. 8 months ago. I had worn the jacket every day since then, through the Eastern Transit corridors and the way station at Karev, and the road through the gray flats and the checkpoint at the zone boundary. And I was wearing it now in the line at Vethara station, with the daylight coming down through the translucent panels and the clock making its small, faithful circuits above the counters. 3 steps of stillness. The counters were staffed by Vethara registrants. I had known this from the documentation. What the documentation had not quite conveyed was the physical presence of them. The way they occupied the space behind the counters with an absolute economy of movement, the way they held themselves, the pale gray of their skin in the afternoon light, the way their eyes tracked and registered and noted without any of the small social performances that human eye contact involves. There were 6 of them, 1 per counter, and each one was processing the person in front of them with the same methodical thoroughness that I imagined they brought to every task. Item by item, question by question, notation by notation, the log building in the terminal to their left with each exchange. The Vethara were not hostile to us. That was the first and most important thing the relief workers at Karev had told me. They are not hostile, they had said, but they are thorough, and they will catalog everything you carry. Everything. If you carry something you do not want in a record, leave it outside. I had thought about that advice for a long time on the road and concluded that I had nothing I wanted to leave outside. What I was carrying was what I was carrying. If they wanted to log it, they could log it. The line moved. I was 4 people from the front. I used the time to watch the registrant at counter 3, because that was the counter I was angling toward. I was good at reading patterns, having had 8 months to practice the skill of reading the patterns of strangers in various lines and processing stations, and what I read in the counter 3 registrant was this. It was efficient without being rushed. It asked a question, waited for the answer, made its notation, asked the next question. There was no impatience in it, but there was also no hesitation. It knew what the next question was before the current one was fully answered. I had heard people in the line saying that the registrants were machines, but that was not quite right. There was something more than mechanical in the way the counter 3 registrant worked. It was more like what you see in a very experienced craftsman, someone for whom the technique has long since moved below conscious thought and become simply the shape of their hands, the weight of their attention, the absence of wasted motion. I had worked with people like that before the transit years. There had been a man on my old construction crew, a framing carpenter, years older than the rest of us, who had been doing the work since before some of the younger crew members were born. He never looked busy. He moved from task to task with a kind of settled authority, and if you watched him, you couldn't see the effort behind the result, the same way you can't see the weight behind a practiced signature. The registrant at counter 3 had that quality, not mechanical, mastered. 2 people, 1 person, then me. The registrant at counter 3 was slightly smaller than I had expected up close. They varied in height the way any species does, and this one came to about my shoulder. Its eyes were a pale amber color with an elongated iris, and when it looked up at me as I stepped to the counter, I had the brief, disorienting sensation that it had already formed an impression of me from the queue and was now simply confirming it. Identification document, it said. Its intergalactic standard was clean and precise, the words placed with care the way they are when a speaker has learned a language thoroughly and uses it with deliberate respect for its structure. I produced the document. The registrant held it flat on its scanning surface, waited a moment for the terminal to process, then handed it back. You are Davin Orel. Yes. Point of origin, Karev Way Station Checkpoint, Transit Corridor 7 East. Duration of transit, 8 months and 4 days. Purpose of arrival at Vethara Station. Resettlement processing, I said. The documentation from the zone boundary office said to present herefore. Yes, it said. Not cutting me off, it had simply reached the end of what it needed from that line of inquiry and moved forward. I will need to catalog the items you are carrying. Please place the contents of your pack on the counter surface. I unslung the pack and set it on the counter and began to take things out. The registrant catalogued as I went. A water filtration unit, it scanned it, noted the model designation and the age, made its notation. A folded thermal sheet scanned, noted condition, logged as functional. A medical kit, the compact kind, with the contents listed on the inside of the lid. It opened the lid, verified the contents against the list, closed it, logged it. 3 nutrition bars still in their original sealed packaging. 2 loose ones without packaging, scanned, logged. The unpackaged ones noted as origin unverified. A fire tool, a folding multi-implement, a worn paper map of the transit corridors that was by now so outdated as to be almost useless, but that I had kept because the habit of carrying a map was older in me than the habit of being in a world where the maps kept changing. A spare pair of socks, a short-handled folding knife, which I had declared at the zone boundary checkpoint and had the declaration chit for, which I produced and set beside it on the counter. The declaration chit is accepted, the registrant said. It scanned the chit and the knife both. Item 6. I watched it work through the pack. There was something almost restful about the methodical quality of it, the scan, the notation, the question when clarification was needed, the answer accepted and logged. No judgment, no comment beyond what the log required, just the steady accumulation of record. It reached the jacket. I had folded the jacket and set it on top of the pack contents after I laid them out on the counter. I had not thought twice about doing so. The registrant picked it up, turned it over, noted the type and approximate age, ran its scanner over it. Then it paused. The pause was brief, perhaps 2 seconds, but it was distinct, different from the smooth, continuous motion of the previous 6 items. The scanner had registered something that the registrant's terminal was not resolving cleanly, and the registrant was waiting for the resolution. It set the scanner down and looked at the patch directly. Then it picked the jacket up and turned the patch toward the light. The afternoon light coming down through the panels caught the embroidered thread, and you could see the slight irregularity of the stitching, the pull at the corners, the slightly wider gap between the 4th and 5th letters, the R that ran a fraction off angle. The registrant set the jacket down on the counter, with the patch facing up. This item, it said, item 7. Yes. The textile composition is consistent with a patch of manufactured origin. The thread is consistent with common embroidery-grade material of human manufacture, age between 18 months and 3 years. The dye on the base fabric is faded in a pattern consistent with regular exposure to ambient light and moderate weather. It looked at me. The letters, these are human script characters. Yes. Can you confirm the word they form? I looked at the patch for a moment. I had looked at it so many times in the past 8 months that I knew it the way you know the features of your own hands, not by description but by feel, by the specific weight of the attention you give it. It's a name, I said. The registrant held a moment. A name, a personal designation. A person's name, yes. The name of the individual documented on your identification document. No. Another pause, this one longer, and different in quality. The first pause had been the terminal resolving a scan. This one was something else. The registrant's amber eyes moved from the patch to me and back to the patch, and there was in that movement something I could not quite categorize, which was unusual because, in my experience, registrants were highly categorizable. Is the named individual listed in your accompanying documentation? A family member registered to your travel authorization? No. An individual anticipated to be at the destination facility? No. The registrant looked at the patch for another moment. Then it turned to its terminal and I watched the cursor on the screen. It had been moving in a smooth, steady rhythm through the log entries, item 1 through item 6, each one populated with clean data, the fields filling left to right in the ordered way of a record being completed. Now the cursor sat in the classification field for item 7 and did not move. "I will need to record the function of this item," the registrant said, not apologetically, not awkwardly, factually, the way you would state a requirement of the process. The log requires a function notation for all personal effects. I understood. It was not an unreasonable requirement. 8 months of transit processing had given me a clear picture of what the registrants needed from their logs, a complete record, item by item, function assigned to each, the record as complete as the thing it described. An item without a function notation was an item without a place in the record. A gap in the record was a problem. The registrant was not trying to intrude on anything. It was trying to finish its log. "That is my son's name," I said. The registrant did not respond immediately. It was looking at me with the same quality of attention it had been giving the patch, and I was aware of being assessed in the same way the jacket had been assessed. Scanned, noted, the data accumulating in some internal process that I did not have access to. "Your son," it said at last. "Yes. He is not documented in your travel authorization. He is not listed as an accompanying individual." "No. He is." The registrant paused in a way I had not heard it pause before. The previous pauses had been computational, the system resolving an ambiguity. This one was different. It was the pause of a mind that has reached for a category and found the shelf empty. "He is not living." It was not a question. The registrant had concluded it from the available data, the way it concluded everything from the evidence. And the evidence was clear enough. A man traveling alone with an identification document that listed no family members, carrying a name patch on a jacket that bore no other name, and answering no to every logical alternative. "No," I said, "he is not living." The registrant looked at the patch again. The afternoon light was still coming through the panels, and the stitching was still visible, and the 7 letters were still there, reading the same way they had read every other time I had looked at them in the past 8 months. "The patch," the registrant said, "it was made by a person who knew your son." "His mother made it," I said, "after he died. Before I left." "She gave it to you?" "Yes." "To carry?" "Yes." I had not told any of this to anyone before, not because I was keeping it hidden. It was not a secret. It was just a thing that lived in the interior of a person and did not often find its way out, but because there had not been anyone on the road who had asked. The way stations and checkpoints had processed me for what I was carrying in practical terms: credentials, declared items, medical clearances. Not this. The registrant was the first person or being or entity of any kind to look at the patch and ask what it was, and it had asked because its log had an empty field, and I found I did not resent that reason. It was an honest reason. It was the kind of reason that does not dress itself up as something more than it is. "He was 4 years old," I said. I did not say it to fill the silence or to explain anything. I said it because it was true, and because the registrant had asked what the patch was, and part of what the patch was that. The registrant was quiet for a moment. 4 years, it said. "Yes." It turned back to the terminal. The cursor was still sitting in the classification field for item 7, unmoved. I watched the registrant look at it, and then I watched it look at the patch again, and then I watched it look at the list of classification categories available in the drop-down field. I could see the list from across the counter. It was a long list, more than 50 entries, covering everything from edged implement to navigational aid to consumable foodstuff to communication device to currency equivalent. There was a category for personal protective equipment, and a category for clothing, and a category for identifying document, and a category for sentimental object, and a category for memorial object. The registrant hovered over memorial object. I could see its stylus pause there. It did not select it. It moved the cursor away. I understood why. Memorial object was accurate the way a census record is accurate. It contained the right information without the information being quite right. A memorial object was a plaque on a wall, a photograph in a frame, an inscribed stone. A memorial object was something you displayed or preserved or maintained. The patch on my jacket was not that. The patch on my jacket was something you wore. It was not maintained. It was not preserved. It was getting older and the dye was fading and the stitching was starting to go at the left corner, and one day it would wear through completely, and I would be left with a faded square of canvas and the ghost of 7 letters that even I would eventually struggle to read. It was not being preserved. It was just being carried. There is a difference between those two things, and the registrant had apparently recognized the difference, and the registrant's database did not have a category for it. I had not thought, until that moment, about the fact that the database did not have a category for it. I had spent 8 months carrying the thing, and not once had I thought about how you would classify it if you needed to put it in a log. It had not seemed like a problem that required solving. It was a patch on a jacket with a name on it, and I wore the jacket every day, and that was the full extent of the thing as far as I had ever needed to think about it. But the registrant needed to put it in a log, and now I was thinking about it, and I found that the thinking about it was doing something in the middle of my chest that I was not entirely prepared for. His name was Matev, I said. I had not said his name aloud to another person I thought about it, 4 months. Since the last way station where there had been another refugee family from the eastern sectors, a woman and her teenage son, and we had shared a fire and food, and the conversation had drifted in the way that conversations drift when people are tired and at ease, and I had mentioned having had a son, and the woman had asked his name and I had said it. 4 months ago. The registrant wrote it down. It had a small personal notation stylus, and it wrote the name in its own script on a separate physical notepad it kept beside the terminal, not the terminal log, not the official record. The notepad. I had not noticed the notepad before this moment. I watched the registrant write the name, and I recognized the motion of the characters even though I could not read the Vethara script. 7 characters in their notation, the same as in ours. It had not needed to ask me how to spell it. Matev, it said. It was the first time I had heard the name in a non-human voice. It was slightly different, the middle vowel elongated, the final consonant given a precision that human mouths tend to soften. But it was recognizably the name. It was recognizably his name. Yes, I said. The registrant set the stylus down. It looked at the terminal and the open field and the list of categories and the cursor sitting in the blank space. Then it looked at the patch again for a long time. I had been in this line for 3 hours. There were people behind me. I was aware of them in the peripheral way that you are always aware of the people behind you in a line, their patience, their tiredness, the weight of their own packs and their own histories standing there in the bright daylight of Vethara Station, each of them with their own item 7s and their own blank classification fields and their own reasons why the available categories were not quite right. I did not feel any urgency about moving them forward. I noticed, with the mild academic interest of a person who has had 8 months to get used to feeling things and setting them aside to be dealt with when there was time and space for it, that the thing happening in the middle of my chest had not gone away and was not diminishing, and was in fact the most significant thing I had felt since the last way station with the woman and her son, and possibly since longer ago than that. It was not grief exactly, though grief was part of it. It was something more specific. The precise sensation of being seen, of having a thing that you carry every day and never explain suddenly be seen by someone who had no context for it, and who was trying, with genuine effort, to find a place for it in their understanding. The registrant trying to classify the patch was not different, I thought, from the patch itself. Both were attempts to put something in a place. The patch was an attempt to put Matev in a place where I could still carry him, not in memory only, which fades and shifts and lies to you, but in something touchable that would keep being itself regardless of what time did to my recollection. The registrant's log was an attempt to put everything in its correct place so that the record was complete and true and could be trusted. Neither attempt was wrong. Both attempts were honest. The difference between them was that one of the attempts had a methodology that could not accommodate the other, and that gap, that single blank field in an otherwise complete and accurate record, was not a failure of the methodology. It was just the shape of the thing. I thought about the day he had died, and made myself stop thinking about it, the way I had been making myself stop thinking about it for 3 years and 2 months with varying degrees of success. I thought instead about the day before, which was a day I was allowed to think about because nothing about it was unbearable. We had been at the public ground near the house, the open stretch of packed earth where the older children played in the afternoons, and he had been fascinated by a beetle. Not a remarkable beetle, a small, dark, unremarkable beetle going about its business in the packed earth, but he had crouched over it for a very long time, watching with the quality of attention that small children bring to small things. I had crouched beside him. He had not looked up. He had said quietly that the beetle was thinking. I had asked how he knew. He had said you could tell by the way it walked. I had no idea if that was true of beetles. I did not think it was. But I had not contradicted him because the premise was interesting enough to leave standing, and because the way he said it, with that flat, certain gravity that 4-year-olds use for pronouncements, was one of the things I liked most about him. He would have been 4 years and 7 months on the day I left. She had sewn his name into the jacket so that I would carry something he had touched, or something that had been made for him and was therefore in some sense his. He had never touched the jacket. She had touched it when she sewed it, and I had touched it every day since. That was the chain of contact. It was indirect and it was thin, and it was also the only chain there was. "May I ask," the registrant said, "how old you are?" It was not a question that appeared to follow from anything that had been said, and I found it slightly surprising, which was unusual given that I had not been surprised by much in the past 8 months. 46, I said. The registrant noted it. Whether it noted it in the official log or on the personal notepad, I could not tell. And Madhav, it said. He was 4 years old at the time of his death. Yes. How long ago? 3 years and 2 months. Another notation. The registrant was quiet for a moment with the stylus in its hand. The patch, it said, it has been on the jacket for how long? Since the morning I left, 8 months and 4 days. You have worn it every day. Every day. The registrant looked at the patch. The afternoon light had shifted slightly in the time we had been talking. The sun was a little lower, and the angle of the panels was different, and the patch was in a slightly softer light now, the embroidery thread no longer throwing the small crisp shadows it had been throwing earlier. But the letters were still legible. M-A-T-T-E-V, and then the last letter, the final letter sewn in that same uneven hand, still there. I had a thought standing there that I had not had before. I had worn the jacket every day for 8 months, and in all of that time I had not thought of it as showing the patch to anyone. I had not thought of the patch as visible. It was on the outside of the jacket, obviously, in plain view of anyone who looked, but I had not been thinking of it as displayed. I had been thinking of it as carried. The distinction had not seemed important until this moment, when the distinction suddenly seemed like the only important thing. You carry something on the outside of your jacket and everyone can see it. But if you are not thinking of it as shown, then it is not being shown. It is just there. Madhav's name had been visible on my jacket for 8 months to everyone who looked at it in lines, at checkpoints, around fires in way stations, on the road in the gray flats, and as far as I knew, no one had ever looked at it. Or if they had not asked. Or if they had asked, I was not remembering it. But the registrant had looked at it with its amber eyes and its scanner and its terminal, and it had asked, because it had an empty field to fill, and it was trying to do its job correctly. And that asking was the first time in 8 months that I had been required to answer the question of what the patch was out loud in words to another person. The registrant was still looking at the patch. I was aware that we had been at the counter for longer than any of the other exchanges I had observed from the queue, and I was aware that there were people waiting, and I was aware that the registrant was aware of both of these things and was not, apparently, doing anything about them. I thought about offering to move on. I thought about saying I could come back, or that the item could be logged as clothing for the purposes of the record, or that the classification did not matter to me and the registrant could use whatever field seemed closest. I thought about all of those things and did not say any of them, because none of them were true. The classification did matter to me. It mattered in a way that was not reasonable or proportionate to what it was, a notation in a transit processing log that no one would ever read. But it mattered nonetheless, the way small things matter when the small thing is carrying something larger than itself. "I have been a registrant for 17 of your years," the registrant said. It was not looking at the terminal, it was looking at the patch. "In 17 years, I have processed a very large number of individuals at a very large number of transit and resettlement stations. I have catalogued, I am told, more than 400,000 items in that time." It paused. "I have never had an item that I could not place in an existing classification." "I understand," I said. "If you need to use the closest available." "No," the registrant said, not sharply, firmly, the way you would say no to something you had actually considered and rejected rather than something you were refusing out of habit. "No, the closest available classification would not be correct." I did not say anything to that. "The function of this item," the registrant said, "is not memorial. A memorial is something you visit. This is something you carry. It is not sentimental. Sentimental objects are carried for the pleasure of the carrier. You do not wear this patch for pleasure." It looked at me with its amber eyes. "You wear it because it is the form in which he continues to exist. The patch is the form his existence takes, given the other forms are no longer available." It was the most accurate thing anyone had ever said about the patch. I had not said it to the registrant. The registrant had derived it, the way it derived everything, from the available data. The age of the patch and the duration of my transit and the question about what it was and the way I had answered. 17 years of cataloging, and this was the thing at the end of it, a blank field, and a man at a counter, and an item that had no category because no one had ever built a category for it, because the thing it was had always been so obvious that no one had thought to name it. I did not respond for a moment. The thing in my chest was doing something that I was not going to deal with here, in a line, in a transit station, in front of a registrant who was trying to fill in a field in an official log. I had 8 months of practice at setting things aside, and I applied that practice now and stood at the counter in the afternoon light, and kept my face in the same condition it had been in for the past 8 months, which was the condition of a face that has learned how to be present without being rower than the day requires. "Yes," I said, "that is what it is." The registrant turned back to the terminal. The cursor was still sitting in the classification field. The registrant looked at the list of available options for a moment. I could see it doing this, the cursor moving down the list slowly, not selecting anything, and then it moved the cursor out of the classification drop-down entirely. It opened a different field, a text field, a free-form notation field that appeared below the standard classification drop-down, one that I had not seen populated on any of the previous items. It began to type. I could not see exactly what it was typing from across the counter. The text was small. But I could see the motion of typing, the steady, deliberate keystrokes of someone writing something with care rather than filling in a form, and I could see that it was more than a single word or a category label. It was a sentence, or more than one sentence. It was a notation of some length. The registrant typed for a while, longer than any of the other items had taken. I stood at the counter and let it type, and behind me the line was still there in the bright daylight of Vethara Station, and the clock above the counters was still making its faithful circuits, and the dust motes were still moving through the afternoon light, and none of that stopped or changed or made any accommodation for what was happening at counter 3. When it stopped typing, it did not speak. It sat for a moment with its hand still on the keyboard. Then it picked up its stylus and made a small additional notation on the personal notepad that was not part of the official log. I could not see what it wrote. It was brief, 2 or 3 characters in the Vethara script. Then it turned to the terminal and completed the rest of the log entry for item 7. I watched the fields populate: dimensions, age, condition. The classification field was still blank, the drop-down not selected. The free-form notation field was filled. I could not read the content. The registrant folded the jacket carefully and set it back on top of my pack. It had folded it with the patch facing up. "Your processing is complete," it said. It handed me a transit documentation form, freshly stamped, with my name and identification number and the Vethara Station entry timestamp, and all the other information that the form required. "The resettlement intake office is on the 3rd level, through the corridor to your left. They will expect the transit documentation." "Thank you," I said. "Davin Orel." It said my name the way it had said Madev's name earlier, with the precision of someone giving a name its correct weight. "The log record for your processing today will be retained in the Vethara Station archive as part of the standard documentation. It will not be accessed unless there is a specific administrative reason to do so." "I understand. However," it paused, "the notation I made for item 7 is complete. I want you to know that it is complete." I looked at it. "Thank you," I said again, and I meant something slightly different by it this time. I picked up my pack and slung it over one shoulder and walked away from the counter toward the corridor on the left. The afternoon light was still coming through the panels. The line moved forward. Someone else stepped to counter 3. I did not look back. The resettlement intake office was on the 3rd level, and the corridor to it was a long one, and I walked it slowly because there was no immediate reason to walk it quickly, and because slow walking in a well-lit corridor was still a pleasure that I had not entirely exhausted in 8 months of hurrying through the gray flats. The corridor was quiet at that hour. It ran along the inner wall of the station structure, and there were 3 windows set into the outer wall, real windows, looking out over the approach road below and the gray flat landscape beyond it and the sky above all of that, which was the particular blue of a late afternoon in a place where the weather was dry. I stopped at each window for a moment, not for any reason I could have articulated, just because each window was there, and the light through it was good, and I had walked a long way to get to it. At the second window, I thought about the registrant again, about the specific quality of its attention, the way it had looked at the patch with the same focused care it had applied to the water filtration unit and the folding knife and the spare pair of socks. It had not treated item 7 differently until the classification failed. Until that moment, it had been proceeding on the assumption that every item would resolve cleanly into an available category, because in 17 years and 400,000 items, every item had. The assumption was well-founded. The assumption had failed once, and the registrant had not papered over the failure. It had sat with the blank field and thought about it and produced, out of 17 years of cataloging experience and an apparently inexhaustible capacity for precision, the most exact description anyone had ever given of what the patch was. The patch is the form his existence takes, given the other forms are no longer available. I stood at the second window for a while. The blue was still there above the gray flat. The afternoon was still there. The registrant was still at its counter, processing the next person in line, working through their items with the same economy and thoroughness. Somewhere on its terminal, In the free-form notation field of a log entry for item 7 of 312, there was a complete record. I had not thought about completeness before, not in those terms. The grief I had been carrying for 3 years and 2 months was not complete. It was ongoing, the kind that does not resolve or close, but rather becomes familiar, a permanent feature of the landscape that you stop noticing until something makes you notice it again. The transit had been ongoing. The walking had been ongoing. The jacket had been ongoing. None of it was complete. Everything was still in the middle of itself. But the registrant's record was complete, every field filled, and because it was complete, it was, in some small and entirely non-mystical sense, finished, fixed. The thing had been observed and described and placed in a record that would persist regardless of what happened to the person who had been carrying item 7. Davin Orel might not make it to Herath. The jacket might be lost or stolen or burned. The patch might wear through, as it eventually would, and the letters would fade, and then the letters would be gone. But the record, the specific, accurate, meticulously notated record of what the patch was and what it carried, would remain in the Vethara station archive for as long as the archive existed. He was 4 years old, and a registrant with amber eyes had written it down. I moved on from the window. The intake office was at the end of the corridor. The intake interviews happened over 3 days. The interviewer was a human, a tall, spare woman named Sira Val, who had been working at Vethara station for 2 years, and who had the manner of someone who has heard a great many individual stories and has learned how to hold them without letting the weight of them accumulate in a visible way. She was good at her work. She asked the questions that needed asking and did not ask the ones that did not, and when the answers were complicated, she let them be complicated without requiring them to resolve into something simpler. On the second day, she asked about the patch. "You wore it to the intake session yesterday," she said, "and today." "I wear it every day." "Can I ask about it?" I told her, not as much as I had told the registrant, or rather, not as explicitly. The registrant had required the explicit version because it had an empty classification field. Sira Val did not require the explicit version. She heard enough to understand what it was, the way a person who has heard a great many individual stories learns to hear the shape of a thing from a small part of it. "I'm sorry," she said, simply, not with the elaborate scaffolding that some people build around those words to protect themselves from the weight of them, just the 2 words placed directly. "Yes," I said. "The registrant who processed you," she said. "6th shift, counter 3. "Yes." I heard it opened a new file type yesterday evening, a classification category that doesn't exist in the standard database. It submitted a formal request to the Vethara Administrative Council to have the category ratified and added to the standard catalog. I looked at her. It called the category, she paused, consulting a note on her desk. The literal translation from the Vethara notation is something like continued presence in the form of carried record. It's not a precise translation. The Vethara have a single compound word for it that doesn't have an exact equivalent. I thought about that for a moment. Does the council usually ratify those requests? I honestly don't know. The registrant has apparently never submitted one before. I did not say anything for a moment. The intake office had a window, a real window, not a panel, facing east, and the morning light was coming through it at a shallow angle and falling across the desk between us. It was a particular quality of light, the kind that makes things look very exactly like what they are. "The notation it made in the record," I said. "I don't know what it wrote." "I don't either. Those records are internal." "But it said it was complete." "Yes." I thought about what complete meant. A record with every field filled, every item classified, every notation made, the log as exact as the thing it described. Complete the way the line at the processing counter was complete when the last person stepped away. Complete the way the patch would eventually be complete when the last thread gave way, and the last letter could no longer be read. Complete was not permanent, it was just finished. The placement recommendation, I said. What does it say? Sierra Val turned back to her terminal. We had spent 2 sessions establishing what I could do and what I had done before the transit and what I wanted and what was available and what the intersection of those things looked like. I was a practical person. I had skills that were useful in settlement and reconstruction work. The recommendation was going to say something reasonable, and I was going to accept it, because that was what came next. She told me it was reasonable. I accepted it. I have been at the settlement outpost at Hayrath for 6 months now. It is a small operation, reconstruction and agricultural development. A crew of 14 humans and 3 Vethara technical advisors, located on the coastal flat north of where Vethara Station's transit corridor empties into the broader resettlement territory. It rains here in the mornings and clears by midday, and in the afternoon the light on the water is the kind of light that makes you think of all the afternoons in all the places you have ever been when the light was good. I work construction. I was doing that before everything, and the skills transferred cleanly to the new context, the way practical skills tend to. The work is hard and physical, and at the end of a day I am tired in the right way, the way that makes sleep come easily and breakfast taste like what breakfast should taste like. I have been on the framing crew for most of the 6 months. We are building residential units for the next intake of resettlement arrivals, which is expected in 3 months according to the station transit schedule, and the work has a satisfying logic to it. Each day's progress visible and measurable, the structure rising from its footings in clean incremental stages. There is something useful about building things. I had always known this in a general sense, having worked in construction for 15 years before the transit, but 6 months at Hayrath had made it specific in a way that general knowledge does not. Building a thing requires you to be present to it. The work does not accommodate distraction, not safely, not well. When you are setting framing, the dimension either is correct or it is not. When you are tying rebar, the spacing either holds the specification or it doesn't. There is no room in that for the mind to go elsewhere. 8 hours of concrete specific present tense attention, and at the end of it you have something that stands. I had not had that for 3 years, since before Madev. The grief had taken the present tense and made it porous so that you were always partly somewhere else, partly in the before time, partly in the calculation of how far the before time now was. The work at Hayrath sealed the present tense back up again. Not healed, sealed the way you seal a gap in framing against the weather. Good enough to function, good enough to stand. One of the Vethara technical advisors, a surveyor named Cataloguer, noticed the patch in the 2nd week. It is on the jacket that I wear to work, because I wear the jacket every day, and Cataloguer was helping me with a framing section, and it was close work and it must have come into the sightline. Cataloguer did not ask. It worked beside me for another hour on the framing section, and then, when we were taking a break and I had the jacket off because the afternoon had warmed up, it looked at the patch on the jacket I had folded on the lumber pile and said, in a careful and deliberate way, one word in the Vethara notation system. The word had 7 characters. It was the compound word that Sierra Val had translated as continued presence in the form of carried record, the one the registrant at counter 3 had used in its category proposal. I looked at Cataloguer. The registrant submitted the proposal, Cataloguer said. The council ratified it. It is in the standard catalog now. I picked up the jacket and held it for a moment. What number in the catalog? I asked. Cataloguer told me the number. It was a long number, a new addition at the end of an established sequence, a number that had not existed 6 months ago. He has his own category now, I said. Cataloguer was quiet for a moment. The registrant at Vethara Station has logged, in the 6 months since your processing, 31 other items in that category, from other individuals, other transit records. I thought about that. 31 other people who had arrived at a processing counter, carrying something that the existing categories could not hold. 31 other blank fields that the registrant had looked at and decided it would not resolve by making them fit the wrong box. 31 other patches on 31 other jackets, or whatever their equivalent was. A coin, maybe, or a folded note, or a piece of fabric, or a small specific thing that was the shape of someone's continued presence in the world, carried in the only form that was still available. 31 people in the bright daylight of Vethara Station, who had set their packs on the counter and opened them and laid everything out, and had arrived at item 7, and the registrant had paused and looked up from its terminal. 31 times the cursor had sat in the blank field. 31 times the registrant had looked at the drop-down list and moved the cursor away. 31 times the free-form notation field had been opened, and the careful, deliberate keystrokes had begun. Does the registrant at counter 3 know it is doing that? I asked. That it's building a record of them. I think, Kellareth said carefully, that the registrant would say that a complete log is always preferable to an incomplete one. I put the jacket back on. The afternoon light was on the water and the work was not finished, and there was still half the framing section to complete before the crew knocked off for the day. I picked up my tools and went back to it. I still wear the jacket. The stitching at the left corner is going now. I can see it when I hold the patch up to light, the thread thinning, a hairline gap appearing where the corner fold is sharpest. I have needle and thread in my kit. I have not repaired it yet. I am aware this is not entirely rational, but I am also aware that I am not going to do anything about the left corner until I have thought more carefully about what repairing it means. Whether it means continuing to carry or whether it means something else, and what the difference is, and whether the difference matters. Madev would have been 7 in 3 months. I think about that in the mornings, when the rain is coming in off the coast, and the light through the window of my quarters is the gray, soft, rain-washed kind that is the opposite of the bright direct light of Vethara Station's processing hall. I think about what 7 looks like. I think about what 7 years old is, the particular way a child occupies a space at 7, the specific weight and presence of a 7-year-old in a room. I think about the hands, because hands change between 4 and 7 in ways that you can see if you were paying attention to them at 4. He had small, practical hands. He was already practical at 4, which I thought was probably hereditary. He would have been more practical at 7. I do not know what he would have been at 17 or 27 or 46. I know what he was at 4. I know the specific, weighted, irreducible fact of what he was at 4, and that fact is what the patch carries, and the patch is what carries it, and I am what carries the patch, and that is the full extent of the record as it currently stands. I know about the beetle and the way it walked, and what a 4-year-old made of that. I carry that too, in the way things are carried that have no physical form. Alongside the patch and the jacket and the weight of the pack on my back through 8 months of gray flats, I carry the beetle and the certainty with which he reported what the beetle was thinking. I have no idea if that's what carrying means, technically. I have no idea if that was what she had in mind when she sewed his name in the dark blue thread with her shaking hands. But it is what I have, and it is specific, and it is small, and it is his. There is one more thing. In the 4th month at Hayrath, I received a piece of official correspondence from Vethara Station administration. It was routed through the standard resettlement mail system and arrived in a sealed transit envelope with my name and assignment address on the outside. Inside was a single sheet of Vethara administrative paper, the formal kind, with the station seal at the top, and on it was a printed notation. It was in Vethara script, which I cannot read, but it had been translated at the bottom in standard by whoever processed the outgoing mail. The translation read, Transit Log Archive Vethara Station, Processing Record Davin Orel. Item 7 of 312. Classification. Continued presence in the form of carried record, catalog designation 7441. Notation. Item is a cloth patch, approximately 10 cm square, affixed to the left breast of a heavy weather work jacket. Fabricated from natural blend fabric, off-white, with embroidered letters in dark blue thread spelling a personal name, 7 characters. Stitching consistent with handwork by a single individual under conditions of emotional distress. Slight angle deviation on the third character. Spacing irregularity between characters 4 and 5. Age of fabrication estimated 18 to 30 months at time of processing. Function. The item is the form in which a particular individual continues to exist in the world, given that no other forms are available. The individual's name is Madhav. He was 4 years old at the time of his death. His mother made the patch. His father carries it. The record is complete. I read it twice. Then I folded it and put it in the inside pocket of the jacket, against the lining, where it has been since. The record is complete, not permanent, not resolved, not healed, which is a word people use because they want a word for when the wound stops being open and becomes instead a different kind of feature of the landscape, one that you can see and name and walk around without it taking you down. Not healed, just complete, every field filled, every notation made, the log as exact as the thing it describes. He was 4 years old. His mother made the patch. I carry it. The registrant at counter 3 is still at its station, in the bright daylight of Vethara station, working through the line. Item by item, question by question, the cursor moving in its steady rhythm through the fields, and sometimes 31 times since and more to come, because the lines are long and the transit is ongoing and people carry what they carry. The cursor stops in a classification field and does not move, and the registrant looks at the list of available categories and moves the cursor away. And the freeform field opens, and the careful keystrokes begin. It is building a record of all the things that do not fit the existing categories, all the forms that existence takes when the other forms are gone. I think that record will be long by the time the last line at Vethara station clears. I think it will be the most complete record that has ever been assembled of what it is to carry something you cannot put down, across a distance you did not choose, toward a place you did not know you were going. I think Madhav is in it. The record is complete.